Thanks so much for having me here this evening, and thank you, Susan, Bruce, and George, for taking time from your busy lives to come and learn a little bit about the three tenets of the Zen Peacemakers in this introductory workshop. So let me start by providing a little bit of background and history. Bernie originally practiced at the Zen Center of Los Angeles under Maizumi Roshi, and then once he received Dharma transmission, he moved to New York to found the Zen Center of New York. And at that time, he had acquired a number of students who also left California. Hold on, sorry. Let me turn this off. So he traveled to New York and settled in kind of Yonkers, New York. And people who wanted to work with Bernie and become his students went through a ceremony called Jukai. You may be familiar with it. I'm sure Taizan is. And during that ceremony, you take 16 what are called bodhisattva precepts. And 3 of those precepts are known as the 3 pure precepts, which are cease from harming others, only do good, and do good for others. And because Bernie's focus was on socially engaged Buddhism, his students were very interested in knowing exactly how to operationalize those terms so that they could be involved in direct action to relieve suffering in the community. And so Bernie and some of his senior students reworked those 3 pure precepts into the 3 Zen Peacemaker precepts, which are not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action. So cease from harm became not knowing, do only good became bearing witness, and do good for others became taking action. So tonight we're going to talk about the 3 tenets, and what I'm going to do is kind of define each one. I'm going to provide some examples or some Zen stories that illustrate each of the 3 tenets. And then once we kind of move through that, at the end, I have a case that we'll look at together and see how the 3 tenets apply to that particular case. And of course, with time permitting, we'll do question and answers at the end. So let's just kind of dive into it. So the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemakers are the kind of foundation of everything we do in our practice. And the first tenet is not knowing, letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, about others, and about the universe. So when we're practicing not knowing, we're entering a situation without being attached to my opinion, my idea, my situation, my concept. It's really a stance of being open to the unfolding situation with deep listening and bearing witness, which we'll get into in more detail. So let's take a second and revisit the 4 noble truths, if you all remember those. So the first noble truth is life is marked by suffering. The second noble truth is suffering is caused by desire. The third noble truth is that there is a way to end suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Noble Path, which is kind of the prescription, the action items to practice and liberate oneself from suffering. And what's interesting about the writings around the 4 noble truths is in the first noble truth that life is suffering, the word for suffering is dukkha. And when you look at the Sanskrit word for dukkha, it translates as a wheel where the hub of the wheel is stuck. It won't turn. The wheel can't spin. So nothing new can happen, right? And it's really a metaphor for this idea of having fixed thoughts and ideas about things. When we really fixate and think we really know something, unequivocally, without a doubt, we're kind of stuck there in a way. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Let me illustrate it with a kind of a perhaps humorous metaphor. So in certain parts of Asia, there are people who hunt monkeys for a living. And the way that they do that is they get these clay pots. They're about the size of the monkey, and they have a little narrow hole in the top, just narrow enough for the monkey to get their hand through the hole. And they put a banana in the pot. And the monkeys, of course, who love bananas, come and stick their hand in the pot, grab the banana, and try to pull the banana out. And in the process of doing that, the banana, goes against the narrow opening of the pot, and the monkey gets stuck there. And what's interesting about it is the monkey's desire mind for bananas is so strong that they just can't let go of that banana. And they try and drag it around, but the pot's really heavy, so they're kind of stuck there. And then the monkey hunters come along and just bop them on the head, and they harvest the monkey. So this is kind of a metaphor, right, for fixed ideas. When we really clutch on to something, really think we know, we kind of get stuck a little bit because the world is constantly changing. The two things we know about Buddhism, the primary principles of Buddhism are everything is interconnected, the universe is relational, and everything is changing. So moment to moment to moment, everything is changing, including ourselves, our bodies, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, everything. So to the extent that we get stuck and we're not willing to change, the actual natural flow of life is moving without us. And that is the source of suffering, actually. So when we're in that stuck place in our mind, perhaps one of the best things we can do is just let go of the banana. Just let go of the banana. Okay. And when we let go of the banana, then we enter into not knowing. Okay. So this kind of leads me to a story about Bodhidharma, who was the 28th patriarch in a direct lineage, mind-to-mind transmission all the way back to the Buddha. It was also the first patriarch of Zen. And he traveled to India in around 600 AD, 7th century. Buddhism had been in India since the first century, so it had been around about 500-600 years. And the emperor at that time, Emperor Wu, had been a patron of Buddhism in China. He had spent a lot of the royal treasury of building monasteries and supporting the monks, etc. And when he heard Bodhidharma was coming to China, he was thrilled. He said, we're going to get to meet actually an enlightened master. And so Bodhidharma eventually came to the court of the emperor. And of course, the emperor was very excited because he had done all this work, to promote Buddhism. And so the first thing that he said to Bodhidharma is, he kind of like went through a whole laundry list of, all the things that he'd done. And he said, basically, what merit have I achieved? And Bodhidharma said, no merit whatsoever. And this, kind of, the emperor was like, Now, the emperor had been schooled on this idea of karma and good deeds, and that these were important principles in Buddhism. And if you did really good deeds, then you gained a certain amount of merit, which would also, come back and help you in this life, and also create an opportunity for a much more favorable life the next time around. So he was a little stunned, and he said, oh, well, then what is the highest holy truth? He asked this of Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma said, vast emptiness, nothing holy. And again, the emperor didn't understand. And finally he said, well, who are you then? And Bodhidharma said, I don't know. And that pretty much ended the conversation. And then Bodhidharma left, and he crossed the Yellow River And he went and sat at Shaolin Temple in a cave and stared at a wall for 9 years. So what's kind of going on here, right? What's this about? So it turns out in the English language, which is language is very powerful in terms of shaping consciousness. When you think of it, thinking is just talking to ourselves using language and concepts for the most part. It seemed like the emperor and Bodhidharma were kind of like talking past each other. And why was that, right? Well, in the English language, there's two very fundamental verbs, to be and to have. And depending on how you're living your life, whether you're living a life of being or you're living a life of having, your lives can be very different from each other. When you're living a life of having, it's about acquiring things for I, my, and me. It's about achieving things. It's about becoming someone who's important or valued in some way. It's about standing out, being noticed oftentimes. And it's essentially the world of duality. When you're living a life as being, you're basically living much of your life in this very moment to moment to moment to moment existence, which is a very different kind of experience. And because Bodhidharma was living this moment to moment to moment experience of life, he was in essence kind of talking about the oneness and interconnectedness of life and coming from that place. Where Emperor Wu was really much into the kind of the relative sense of life, right? Achievements and status and accomplishments, even for a good cause, such as promoting Buddhism. And so they couldn't really connect. It's interesting when Bodhidharma was asked, then who are you? And he said, I don't know. When I remember when I first heard that, it's like, well, of course you know who you are, don't you? But when you really penetrate that question, and that's actually, a very important, simple, basic koan, who are you? Because when you look and you try and figure out and find who you are, no matter how hard you look, eventually you realize there's nobody there that's stable and unchanging, that always remains the same, even though everything around us is changing. Another example, there's a philosophy professor who spent his career, his academic career, studying Buddhism and Zen in particular. And finally, he had an opportunity to travel to Japan on sabbatical and actually meet with an actual Zen master and get an audience with him and talk with him about Zen and Buddhism. So he meets with the Zen master, and they're sitting at a little table across from each other, and there's a couple of cups and a pot of tea. And the professor sits down and he starts going on and on and on about all the books that he had written and the articles he'd published and the conferences he attended and the students he had educated, and just really getting into all these ideas that he had about Zen. And of course, the Zen master just sitting there, not really saying anything. And eventually this guy kind of runs out of gas. He runs out of things to say. And the Zen master said, would you like some tea? And he said, yeah, sure. He said, well, hold up your cup. So he held up his cup, and the Zen master started pouring the tea into his cup, and he poured and poured and poured. And eventually the hot tea went over the top of the cup onto the professor's hand, kind of burned him a little bit, not seriously. He said, whoa, why did you just do that? What did you do that for? And the Zen master said, you came here to learn about Zen, but you're so full of your own ideas and concepts that nothing else can go in right now. If you really want to learn Zen, you must first empty your cup. And this sentiment was echoed in the very famous book written by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, the first abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center, when he talked about beginner's mind. And he had a great quote which says, "In the mind of the beginner, there are many possibilities, but in the mind of an expert, there are but a few." And so he really encourages students to keep a beginner's mind, a don't know mind. So let me talk a little bit about some other examples that kind of get to this whole idea of what exactly is don't know mind. And how do we know when we're practicing don't know mind, right? So let's go back to 13th century. Eihei Dogen Zenji, the founder of the Soto sect in Japan, and as part of our lineage in the Zen Peacemaker order, we go all the way back to Dogen. And after going to China and becoming enlightened, he came back to Japan, and one of the first things he did is he wrote a treatise called the Fukan Zazengi, which was the universal recommendation of the principles of Zazen. And essentially, it was an instructional primer on how to practice Zen meditation. And he talked about, physical posture. He talked about the breath. And then he also talked about how do you keep your mind when you're doing Zazen or Shikantaza. And what he said was, quote, "Once you've adjusted your posture, take a deep breath, inhale and exhale, rock your body left and right, and settle into immobile sitting position. Think of not thinking." How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. So what is this non-thinking? What exactly is that? In regard to our everyday life, Joshu asked Master Nansen, "What is the way?" Nansen replied, "Ordinary mind is the way." Joshu asked, "Well, how do I seek after it?" Nansen said, "If you seek after it, you will go in the wrong direction." Joshu then said, "Well, if I don't seek after it, how will I know what it is?" And Nansen replied, "The way is neither knowing or not knowing. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing is indifference." Just a quick note, when Nansen says not knowing, he's talking about trying to suppress thoughts, not the not knowing that I'm talking about. Okay, just a point of clarification. And finally, in another example, a monk asked Yaoshan, "What are you thinking in steadfast and mobile sitting?" Yaoshan said, "I think of not thinking." The monk asked, "How do you think of not thinking?" Yaoshan said, "Beyond thinking." So this non-thinking, not knowing, beyond thinking, what exactly are they pointing to? So there's a very famous Japanese Zen master named Kodo Sawaki Roshi, who was an amazing Zen teacher, kind of a national treasure in Japan. He spent a lot of his time in his life traveling around, kind of as an itinerant Zen teacher, teaching in schools, teaching children, teaching all kinds of people, mostly lay people actually. And one of his students, Kosho Uchiyami Roshi, wrote a book called Opening the Hand of Thought. And Uchiyami Roshi really kind of got down to the nitty-gritty in terms of explaining what exactly is beyond thinking. What is that practice? How do you do that? Okay. And he referred it to basically the practice of Zazen, and particularly Shikantaza. And when you are doing Shikantaza, what you're actually trying to do is just sit with whatever arises, right? Without trying to control it, without trying to extend it, without trying to amplify it. So if you're, and just focus on your posture, just be present with your posture, which we call just sitting, right? Shikantaza, just sitting. So as you're just sitting, when you're sitting zazen, your heart is still beating, your lungs are still breathing, your senses are still, your hearing is still working. And of course, your thought is continuing to produce thought. Your brain is continuing to produce thoughts. So this idea that, zazen is about getting rid of thoughts is untenable because it's not actually even possible. It's not any more possible than trying to stop your heart while you're meditating. Okay. So what do you do with these thoughts when they show up, right? So if this is, my mind and I have a thought and it comes up like this, what he's saying is open the hand of thought, right? Don't try and get rid of it, but just see it for what it is and then come back and focus your practice on your posture. And then you may get sleepy. And when you notice that that's happening, you just simply come back and focus your awareness on your posture. And you just keep doing that over and over and over again. And that's the practice of beyond thinking. Because even when you're practicing beyond thinking, you're still going to have thoughts, right? You're simply not going to engage with those thoughts. An example might be, I'm focusing on my posture, and it's like, oh, I got to go to the dentist tomorrow. And I think my car isn't going to be ready. It's at the shop. And geez, I'm going to need to get a ride to the shop so I could even make that appointment. Geez, is there anybody I know I could call? So once I have that one thought, at least another thought, another thought, another thought, another thought. Beyond thinking is, oh, I got to go to the dentist tomorrow. And then I just come back to my posture. I don't extend or amplify or engage with that thought train. And I just keep doing that over and over and over again, ceaselessly. This is just sitting. This is just shikantaza. So Bernie once wrote that, so this is kind of the idea of not knowing. This is the practice. When we talk about beyond thought, non-thinking, shikantaza, zazen, and not knowing are all interchangeable terms for the same thing. Okay. Which is just being present, doing what I'm doing exactly while I'm doing it. Okay. So Bernie once wrote in his book, one of his books, that the sixth patriarch, Huineng, okay, who was the sixth patriarch of Zen, defined practice as the state of mind in which there is no separation between subject and object, no space between I and thou, you and me, up and down, right or wrong. He said, I call such practice bearing witness. According to this definition, when we do zazen, we bear witness to the oneness of life. And he also said, anything that we do, without separation or denial, like driving a car, cooking breakfast, taking out the garbage, is practice or bearing witness. So now we take this idea of beyond thinking, this actual practice of shikantaza, off the cushion, and we take it into our ordinary everyday life, right? And this is what Nansen meant when he said, ordinary life is the way. Okay. So when we're interacting through our daily life, we continue to practice this not knowing. Okay. And what does that do? Well, it actually sets us up to the practice of bearing witness, which is the next tenet. So let me introduce the next tenet with this little story. Master Jizo asked Hogan, where have you come from? By pilgrimage aimlessly, replied Hogan. What is the matter of your pilgrimage? Asked Jizo. I don't know, replied Hogan. Not knowing is most intimate, remarked Master Jizo. And at that, Hogan experienced great enlightenment. So when we keep coming back to just this moment without being burdened or saddled with all kinds of concepts and ideas, right? And we're present with someone and we're looking to them, at them. And our mind is clear. We're not trying to think about what we're going to say or what we're going to recommend. We're just deeply listening. It's most intimate. We're engaged in a very intimate practice. We're opening our heart and mind to the other and just being present. That's bearing witness. It's not an easy practice. Bernie said, when we bear witness, when we become the situation, homelessness, poverty, illness, violence, death, the right action arises of itself. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to figure out the solution ahead of time. Compassionate action is the functioning of bearing witness. Once we listen with our entire body and mind, loving action arises naturally. How can this be? A monk asked Master Yunmen, what are the teachings of a whole lifetime? Yunmen said, an appropriate response. So when we're working with someone, or a friend, a family member, a client, a business associate, you name it, and we're there, working with them, and we're bearing witness, and we're being present, and they're telling us, what their issue is and the struggle that they're going through. What is the appropriate response? And how do we know what it is? Well, here's a suggestion. Since I took my first breath, I'm the only one who's ever been with me every single moment of my life. There isn't another person on the 7 billion people on this planet that's actually seen this world exactly the way I have. And that's true of each and every one of you. Bernie once said, he made me laugh, he said, all I have is my opinions. I don't know the truth. The world that I live in is the only one that I live in. No one else has lived in this particular world. And the same for you. Same for you. So, and like right now, and we're sitting, at your desk in your homes. I'm here in Vermont, Jeff's in Colorado. And that's an, irrefutable fact, is it not? Right? We could all attest to that, right? Raise your hand if you would attest to the fact that we're all on this thing together. Okay. All right. So our direct experience is always the truth, right? It's always the truth, moment to moment. It's all that it is. It's all that we have, right? It's always the truth. So everything that has happened to me since the moment I was born, and everything that's happened to you since the moment you were born, you bring to each moment. So when you're trying to bear witness and you're really listening deeply and you're really being present for someone else, okay, you're bringing your entire life to that moment. They're bringing their entire life to that moment. Okay, the direct experience of reality. And when that happens, something will arise in that interaction, which will also be the truth of its moment. So your response is always an appropriate response, because you can't step out of it and be something other than what it actually is. It's no coincidence that Yunmen also said at one time, every day is a good day, because it's completely and thoroughly what it is. nothing more or nothing less. The challenge in Zen practice is, can you live with life as it is? Can you embrace it? As John Kabat-Zinn talked about, in its full catastrophe. Okay, so the point isn't, as Bernie would say, to make ourselves holy by bearing witness. The point isn't to, the point is to serve, to offer, to be the offering, and of itself the fruit is born. An appropriate response will appear. Okay. It may, in hindsight, not have been the best response, but at the moment when it happened, it was the most appropriate response. Out of our zazen, out of our bearing witness, the right action arises. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to worry about what's right or wrong. If we function from the state of not knowing, if we bear witness, the offering arises and the fruit is born. I just retired last year after almost 50 years in human services, working with a very diverse population of folks. The last 12 years, I worked for the Veterans Health Administration for the VA, and I ran their homeless program for the entire state of Vermont and half of New Hampshire, housing homeless veterans. And then the last 5 years, I was a Veterans Justice Outreach Specialist and worked with veterans who were charged with felony offenses and were on trial and facing incarceration. And so I spent a lot of time in prisons. I spent a lot of time meeting veterans in their home while they were on bail, et cetera, and really bearing witness to their lives. And worlds within worlds within worlds. And when you really start to bear witness to whatever it is that is what you value and what you're interested in life, it's an endless practice. It's just an endless, continuous practice. So again, this appropriate response idea. One last story I'll share with you was Yin Yang asked his Dharma brother Dawa, why does the Bodhisattva compassion have so many hands and eyes? I don't know if you've ever seen like a picture of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. It's like Kuan Yin in China and Shinreg and Tibetan and Kanzeon in Japan, but it's sometimes a male, sometimes a female, but mostly a female. And it's the Bodhisattva compassion, and she has like 1,000 arms. And in each hand, there's an eye, right? And there's a little trumpet. And the iconography is the one who hears all the suffering in the world and responds to it. Okay? This is the ultimate heart of compassion, which lies deep within each and every one of us. And the more you practice not knowing and bearing witness, the more you come in contact with that part of yourself. And then, as Bernie would say, and for those of us who have worked with him and practiced with him for years, your life becomes service. It seems like you don't really have a choice at some point. It's just something that you must now do based on a realization of the oneness and interconnectedness of all things. And so compassion is not like you don't have to take a course in it. You don't have to, study it for years before you try it. When you embrace the mind of not knowing and, step back from your story, you'd be amazed at how easily you engage in compassionate action. When you get in touch with that part of yourself, your heart, unencumbered by a mind of knowing. Oh, that won't work. That won't really. When I worked in human services, I can't tell you how many staff meetings I sat through and heard licensed clinicians, psychiatrists, PhD psychologists literally write off a person's life because their presentation didn't fit very well with their clinical framework and didn't even have a sense that they were doing that. because they were so steeped in what they thought they knew that they couldn't even see or hear or connect with the very people whose lives they were trying to save. Yeah. So that's my spiel. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to ask you guys, before we get into some questions and answers, to work on a little case together. And I'm going to provide the case, and then based on what you've heard me say about not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action, see how those tenets might be working or not working in this particular case. Okay. So this is a case, it's from 101 Zen Stories, and it's regarding Tanzan and Ikido. So Tanzan and Ikido were once traveling together down a muddy road. A heavy rain was still falling, and coming around a bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, unable to cross the intersection. "Come on, girl," said Tanzan at once. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud. Ikido did not speak again until that night, when they reached a lodging temple. Then he no longer could restrain himself. "We monks don't go near females," he told Tanzan, "especially not young and lovely ones. It's dangerous. Why did you do that?" "I left the girl there," said Tanzan. "Are you still carrying her?" So what do you think, gang? Do you want me to should I say it again? Would it be helpful for me to say it again? Yeah, okay. So Tanzan and Ikido were once traveling together down a muddy road. A heavy rain was still falling. Coming around a bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, unable to cross the intersection. "Come on, girl," said Tanzan at once. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud. Ikido did not speak again until that night, when they reached a lodging temple. Then he no longer could restrain himself. "We monks don't go near females," he told Tanzan, "especially not young and lovely ones. It's dangerous. Why did you do that?" "I left the girl there," said Tanzan. "Are you still carrying her?" I'll give you just a little background too, and then I'll think about. So this was like during there are certain practice periods, which if you are practicing currently, you probably know about these. They're called angos. There's usually one in the summer and one in the winter. And during that time, the monks would leave their home monastery and they would travel around and visit other monasteries. And they usually would go in pairs. So in this example, Tanzan is the older monk, and Ikido, the one who objected, is the younger monk. And they would take a vow at sunrise of silence, and they wouldn't talk until the sun went down. And then they, could converse. And so this happened kind of early in the morning while they were still, in a vow of silence. And it wasn't until later in the day when Ikido spoke up, because the sun had gone down, he could now speak. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit. So where is not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action showing up in this example? Any ideas?
Tanzan, can you hear me?
Yes, George. Thank you.
Yeah, Tanzan had responded with what needed to happen at that time. Ikido had a fixed idea about what monks should and shouldn't do. He even couldn't speak until later that evening. Tanzan just saw that what needed to happen, let go of the fixed ideas about what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, carried the girl across and left it there. That's all it was. Ikido couldn't let go of what he believed was the right thing to do, and ruminated on it, and was stuck for the whole day. It's a beautiful story. I mean, I guess I got the advantage of having heard it before and really thinking about it.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Yeah, how about Susan, Elizabeth, Colleen? Oh, do that.
Hello everyone. Yeah, I've also had the luxury of knowing this story before, and also I was double lucky because I watched one of your presentations from, I believe, last year or a few months ago. I don't know, and that you mentioned the story, and the context was quite useful for me in that occasion, because I had reflected upon it before, but the context adds something, I believe, as George was saying just now. And yeah, but actually the thing that strikes me the most, that there are many things, many thoughts that come out of this small story, but the thing that struck me the most just now was how those three tenets, in this story you can see how they are very much interrelated, I think, because you see just how by bearing witness is the master, that is already in the process of bearing witness, if I understood correctly what it means, is already responding appropriately. It's not like they're separate steps that will also make up some kind of technique, and so that's quite impressive, I think, about the story. It's not just that it illustrates the principle very clearly. It's also that it illustrates how it naturally, spontaneously arises out of the situation. If you don't even need to do anything, actually. It's more the disciple that's doing things, I think. It's actually a process of subtraction. It's not a process of adding something that you need to do. It's just that we are so used to do it, all this projection and protecting ourselves and so on. I think that's what struck me the most.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jacopo, that, in order to kind of talk about the three tenets, it's like we break them out into three distinct things. But I like to think of more like a diamond that has different facets to it, but it's just this one thing, when you're really not knowing, bearing witness and taking action, that can all be happening simultaneously, right? And the other thing too, just to finish that story about Dawu, what does the Bodhisattva compassion have so many hands and eyes? It's just like reaching back for your pillow in the dark. I don't know how well you guys all sleep, but I notice sometimes in the middle of the night, I might wake up or something and I kind of reach back for my pillow to kind of get that comfy feeling that allows me to go back to sleep. And, this is kind of, Dawu was kind of saying the same thing, that compassion is not some big project, that you have to train for or do something super special around. It's natural. It's who we are. It's what we do. It's what we're born to do. Yeah, excellent point, Jacopo. Thank you. Yes, Colleen?
Yeah, ditto, I think, to what's been shared already for sure. And I think just seeing this simple but also profound example in the story just raises the I don't know, the hardship in today's world and really maneuvering life in that way. I think about my work in hospice care, and I have a specific role and scope of practice, and yeah, often am kind of guided and led by more of just that compassionate action. But then I have to, right? Then I have to kind of track it and reassess, is this in my scope? Can I say these things, right? Can I go this direction? And so it quickly becomes a lot more complex. And I really appreciate what you mentioned before when speaking about, whatever kind of that, I was just looking back at what I had written there, but like the action that naturally arises is the appropriate action of the moment. Even if looking back in hindsight, maybe you would have done something differently, but I guess that's always been a source of comfort for me throughout life, and then specifically in the work that I do, is like coming back to that, right? It was like pure intention in the moment. And we can't control the outcome or the effects maybe that it has. And so that's always a source of comfort. But yeah, just this, it's tricky in today's world. And I'm sure we all feel that in like moving. I mean, that's why we're here, right? To reintegrate that, to practice that. And it leaves me with a lot more questions, which is good.
Well, what you're saying is very powerful, because for people who've worked in human services or worked with people who are really struggling, and my sister was a hospice nurse for 10 years. So this ability to just make the best response that you can in each moment in situations where nobody knows what to do. There is no right answer to it. It's just something has to happen. And I think one of the beauties of peacemaker order and the use of the three tenets is it really allows us to just offer ourselves as best we can and then leave it on the table. Just leave it all on the table. That it may not always turn out to be the best thing in the world, but I did the best I could in that moment. And that goes a tremendously long way to preventing burnout. I remember when I first was doing this work, and I was working with kids that were, in group homes, and, just crazy, unsolvable scenarios would come up. And it would really bother me, and I have a lot of anxiety about it. And finally, Father Val Peter, who was the executive director of Boys Town, who I was working with, was just a really smart guy. And one day I was telling him the struggle, and he just looked at me. He's a Midwesterner, and he said, "Jimmy, you gotta know when to hold them and know when to fold them." And that was a spiritual teaching, because what he was really saying is, your ego is trying to save these people. Okay, this is much bigger than you, kid. Just give it your best shot, but come back tomorrow, please, because we need you. Okay.
Yeah, if I may, very, very quickly, also add another thought, just listening to the story this time, for the second time. I try to really listen, actually listen, and it reminded me of another Zen story that I've often thought about when I felt, under pressure by my own desires, demons. I've had my share, as I believe all of us have. This is the Zen story about this old woman that's contributing to the practices and makes offerings to this Zen monk. But at a certain point, she wants to test the realization of this person, how serious it is. And I don't know. I don't want to tell the whole story, but basically, and you probably know I've heard of it already. But again, there is this notion that the reader is almost it's made to expect that what's expected of the accomplished monk is to not feel anything about being tempted by a pretty girl. That's that the old woman sends basically to test his resolve. But actually, she she chases him away with a broom, because he remains completely, I don't care. And oh, come on, he didn't even think for a moment of what was hailing her. He wasn't with her for a moment, for this girl that I sent. That she was faking that she was in love with this monk. And yeah, this just being there, with what's happening. It's something that I continuously forget how. That's already very powerful, I think. We always think we have to do much more, and we lose that very easily. And yeah, that's just another facet, I think, of the same principle that you were explaining through that story.
Yeah, very much so. That is a great story about this monk sitting and in some sense seeing himself as very holy, right? Very saintly. And when the woman sent her daughter to kind of tempt him, he rudely dismisses her in a rather unkind way. And so it brings up the whole, question is like, what are we practicing for here? Right? Is it to become a saint, or is it to, do the best we can in each moment of our lives with the situation that presents itself, and with loving action, as much as that's possible. Very good. Excellent.
Can I
Yes.
ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yes,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Ask your question first.
Sure.
No, please go ahead. I've already spoken. We'll see if there's time. You speak first, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I apologize for coming on late. I had a client that ran late. And what came up for me, and a couple of things, it was this seeing myself at the stoplight where there's usually a person with a sign, homeless veteran or something, who's looking for donations, and sitting in my car, and there's that moment of what to do here. And so I usually keep some granola bars in my car. If I'm close enough, I can hand out a granola bar. But I think that your talk about the three tenets was also offering to me this, and it's not just the guy at the stoplight, it's you hear the news and there's this suffering going on in Gaza, and what do I do comes up again. And so what I was hearing was, here's an opportunity to drop minds. Here's an opportunity to open into the heart of compassion as a real interior, exterior field of experience and awareness. And if I'm there without a thought about what to do, that's what I'm doing, that I'm doing being, and I'm doing being in the way that I believe would be the most beneficial to myself and everyone else. So if there's some action that arises from that connection, then I could trust to follow through with that action. But we're such people conditioned and geared up to like know what to do, know what to do, know what to do, and have the formula and learn the protocol. And it just feels, and I when I came into the group, it was like, when I am with a client, I get to do this work that invites me into that space of bearing witness, of don't know mind, because that's the only way the work works, in connecting with somebody. So there's already that quiet inside, and how lovely to have the chance to know that quiet, that inner quiet.
Well
Thank you.
said, Elizabeth. Well said. Yeah, I'll tell you a quick little story about Bernie. At one point, and when I was working with Bernie, I was the chief operating officer of Zen Peacemakers, and he was the CEO. So we spent every day together for like 5 years. It was truly a gift. And during that 5-year period, he was asked to teach a class on engaged Buddhism at Harvard Divinity School. And I don't know if you know this, but Bernie was a big cigar smoker, and he kind of got me hooked on him as well. So whenever he wanted to go down to Harvard Square to teach a class, he would drive. And because he always wanted someone with him. So we'd smoke cigars on the way down. And he'd go in and teach the class. And while he was teaching the class, I'd go over to Harvard Square and kind of get a coffee and hang out. And then I would pick him up after the class and we'd go back to Harvard Square to smoke another cigar. So one day, I picked him up and we parked the car and we were walking back to Harvard Square and I was a homeless guy. And really in tough shape, very malodorous and, his eyes were kind of blurry and, and he kind of almost like barked at Bernie as we were walking by, hey man, you got any spare change, And Bernie just turned and walked over to the guy, big smile on his face. Said, hey man, how you doing? And the guy kind of, took a step back and he said, did you sleep out last night? Which means, did you stay in a shelter or did you have to sleep on the street? And he said, yeah, man, I was on the street last night. He goes, well, it's nice to see you. How you doing today, right? And pretty soon, out of nowhere, these two guys are chatting back and forth like they've been buddies for 20 years, right? And then finally, at some point, Bernie put out his hand and he said, been great talking to you. And the guy said, thank you so much. God bless you, God bless you. Big smile on his face. And we walked away. We never gave him anything, right? Or did we? Or did he, right? So Bernie talks a lot about the offering is ourself, right? The offering is ourself. And in that case, he was just offering friendship and acknowledging and giving this person human dignity in a place where, because I've worked with a lot of homeless people, it's harder to get much lower in society than to have no place to live, no friends, no family, no support, no money, nothing basically. And I've done a bunch of street retreats. The Zen Peacemakers are known for doing these bear witness street retreats, which are like going to the Auschwitz death camps and working with the Native Americans out in the Dakotas, and the street retreats and bearing witness to racism in the South, and just a lot of different kinds of opportunities. But I remember one time Bernie couldn't make it to Harvard and he asked me to teach the class. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And he said, just do it. And that was Bernie, right? So I go down there and I'm sitting in this room with all these, Harvard graduate students. And somebody asked the question, every time I go down the street, a homeless person asks me for money, should I give them money every time? And my answer was, no, you got to decide what works for you, right? Offer whatever you feel you can. And that's an appropriate response. And it sounds like, you're talking a little bit about, seeing clients. It's the same thing. I mean, I have a private practice, psychotherapy practice, and there are times I have no idea what to do with a client. I absolutely have no idea what to do in the moment with the client. It's not like I have some great knowledge that I can just access and, oh, that's a problem. I got this for that. Oh, this is your concern. Oh, sure, then just do this. I mean, I'm totally clueless. But the one thing I am is I'm in relationship with them and we are connected and we'll figure something out, either that session or the next. And it always seems to roll that way.